tonight is well qualified to speak on this subject. She did her master's thesis on the company town, Sugar Land. She is a local historian. She is a noted author, has co-written 3 books on the history of the Baylor College of Medicine, now working on a 4th book. She is a member of the Fort Bend Historical Commission. She's a great activist and a great friend. Would you please help me welcome Diane Ware?
Good evening. I'm going to set the framework of what I'm going to speak about tonight. We could talk about the company town itself. We'd go on for hours. There's a great book about that written by Robert Armstrong, if you want to read that. I could show you 1,000 slides. There are thousands of them. But the Sugar Land Historical Historic Foundation has all of those, so you can check those there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the oral histories that I collected when I was doing my thesis and a little afterward, and I'm going to let the people who lived in the company town explain what it was like to live here. We've all heard about company towns. Nothing is good that we've ever heard about a company town, but this is our basic definition. In the Merriam-Webster, the definition comes directly after company store and directly before company union, which seems to be a natural progression of things. There was no national legislation that protected anybody who lived in a company town until the 1930s, so whatever the owners wanted to do, they could do. At the peak in the late 1800s, there were over 2,500 company towns in the United States, and they housed over 3% of the U.S. population, so there were a lot of them around. T.C. Roselle was one of the people that helped. You're going to hear some voices more than others. And T.C.'s voice will come out loud and clear all evening long. T.C. Roselle. There were other company towns, you see, in East Texas, lumber towns that were company. Oil companies had what they used to call camps. Sugar Land was a company town, single industry, raised and refined sugarcane. It was owned entirely by the partnership of Isaac Kempner and William T. Eldridge. And those 2 men owned everything. It was so much a company town that they even owned the rail line that went in front. So it was everything. Let's look at the 2 men that owned the partnership. Just quickly, there's a lot that could be said. We could have a lecture on each of them. But let's look at the difference in the partnership. William T. Eldridge was 12 years old. He was born in 1862. He was 12 years old when he finally left home. He was self-made and self-destructive many times. He claimed under oath in court that he never had a lesson inside a schoolhouse in his life, but he was not illiterate, but not very well educated. According to Robert Armstrong, another voice you'll hear a lot tonight, Robert Armstrong, there wasn't anything stupid about him. Eldridge was into big things. He was not a small thinker. He was a marshal in Eagle Lake, Texas. That's when he killed the first 3 men that he killed. He was taken up on charges, first-degree murder. He was acquitted because a local businessman spoke in his behalf, and the local businessman who spoke out for him was William Donovan. Robert Armstrong provided me with some transcripts, some court transcripts of murder trials. And I want to give you the story behind those. According to Robert Armstrong, Otis Enquist found these paper-wrapped packages with both original Eldridge court transcripts under the Ellis house after Eldridge died. Enquist brought them to Armstrong because they'd been roommates at Texas A&M. Robert Armstrong told Imperial President Herbert Kempner about the transcripts and that I wanted to write a book about Eldridge. Herbert took them to his father, Isaac Kempner, who told me that he felt that an Eldridge biography shouldn't be written until Eldridge's son, Randall, passed away. Randall died in 1987. That's the year that Mr. Armstrong wrote his book on the company town. The transcripts were from murder trials in 1902 and 1905. They were for the murder of William Donovan, the man who stood up for Eldridge in court, and for his brother-in-law, John C. Calhoun. I read the transcripts and I asked Mr. Armstrong, who knew Eldridge personally, what his take was on this. He believed that Eldridge personally shot both men because he planned it. He knew that Donovan would be taking a train and he ambushed him, and he likewise threw open a curtain of Calhoun's berth on another train and shot him 4 times. Robert Armstrong. It was the method most consistent with Eldridge's character. By the time Eldridge went for his 3rd murder trial, he was only tried 3 times because 2 of the men he killed were not white, and you were not tried for murdering non-whites in the late 1800s. But by the time he went to trial, he co-owned the property here in Sugar Land with Isaac Kempner. The issue did not go away, however, even though he was acquitted. Robert Armstrong. Eldridge joined my parents in their home to play bridge. Now, this is after 1923. We're talking 20 years later. Eldridge wouldn't sit in a lighted, undraped room after dark because he'd been shot in the back once and he'd killed 5 men. He wasn't sure that the Donovan heirs were through with him. So before he would come in, we'd go around and we'd pull all the shades down, even in the summertime, and there was no air conditioning. This slide is of the gravesite of Donovan and Calhoun, and you'll notice that it's a very angry avenging angel. Okay, let's bounce what we know about Eldridge off from what we know about Mr. Kempner. Isaac Kempner was 11 years younger than Eldridge. He was born in 1873. He had a very privileged childhood. The family home took up 7 city blocks in Galveston. He was well educated. He went to a boarding school in Virginia to prepare to study law at Washington and Lee College. In 1894, about 6 weeks before he was due to graduate, his father died suddenly, and he had to leave school to come home as the oldest son to run the H. Kempner Trust. It was $1.5 million at the end of the 1800s. He managed to lose several $1,000s by some bad investments, and pretty soon he developed a habit of looking for experts in fields before he ever went into that area. In 1905, he began investing heavily in banking, and he met A.A.B. Warhide, who was the trustee for this property, the Cunningham properties that were bankrupt here in Sugar Land. And that's how he met Eldridge. Warhide introduced the 2 men. They became partners in 1905. Kempner recognized Eldridge was a self-made man. He believed that he was well-trained. He had considerable vision. And most of you know that his mother did not agree with him. Isaac Kempner's mother was very concerned that Eldridge would not hesitate to murder her son. Now, we've heard some scathing, some criticism of Eldridge. We kind of know that, but as I went around town and talked to different people and interviewed and just talked at random to people, I could never find a criticism of Isaac Kempner. This is the closest criticism I could find. I loved that old man Kempner, even if he was a Jew. That was it. Everyone just loved him, and I couldn't, I don't know if it was mythical, but they just all really liked him. Employee Luther Brock. Mr. Kempner and Mr. Eldridge were nothing alike. Eldridge was a tightwad, a man killer. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. I always wondered how they got together because they seemed to be opposite. Mr. Eldridge was, I don't know if rough would describe it, but the Kempners seemed to be more polished society people than Mr. Eldridge was. That was probably an understatement. Robert Armstrong. Eldridge's motive to build the company town? To gain favor with Mr. Kempner, who was a good, kind man. Kempner remained in Galveston, and Eldridge moved to Sugar Land as the resident general manager. In 1908, they had the Ellis Plantation House moved from west of town onto the refinery grounds so that Eldridge could live there. Both men agreed on one thing, that they would not profit from their workers outside the workplace. Robert Armstrong. Eldridge had printed his own money in other towns. Sugar Land was as isolated as those towns. Given his own inclination, he would have had that same kind of town. But Mr. Kempner said, "No, I don't want it done that way." Luther Brock. Shopping before the Depression, they had coupon money, book money, good only in Sugar Land. But they'd swap it for 90% of the cash value. They used it for many years. 90% is a very high swap value for company script. The partnership was a 50-50 split of holdings financed by Kempner money. Eldridge also received an annual salary of $5,000 plus a 5% profit share. The partnership allowed Eldridge sole ownership of the Sugar Land Railroad. And there's a lot of theories, but nobody really knows why that was allowed. The Sugar Land Railroad ran parallel to Highway 6, from Sugar Land down toward Arcola. Eldridge borrowed Kempner money on condition to repay it out of his 5% profit share. Of course, nobody knew if we were going to make any profits, did they? Robert Armstrong. Took a lot of nerve to ask Mr. Kempner for stuff, but Eldridge knew what he was doing the job that Mr. Kempner wanted. Eldridge was careful to do that. As Eldridge began to see his successes, he began to see that Mr. Kempner was impressed. And that's when he began asking for more. That's the kind of guy he was. Took 3 years to acquire all the property for Sugar Land. And I asked Mr. Armstrong about it, and he said it was so convoluted that the minutes didn't even specify all the details. So no one really knows how it all went. 1909, they bought some. Or by 1909, they bought everything. They had incorporated Imperial, and they now owned about 18,500 acres. 2 raw sugar mills, the refinery, cotton gins, a saloon, barracks for the convict laborers, rail lines, and a whole lot more. Everything had been in foreclosure. Everything was in terrible shape. The refinery was not set up for year-round production, and so they've got a mess on their hands, and they have to start turning a profit. The first thing they need is a workforce. So convicts are here, and the state of Texas did a convict lease system after the Civil War. They took the convicts and they let planters lease them back. It was pretty despicable. It was an awful system, but they were here. Both Eldridge and Kempner had already employed convict labor. So Mr. Kempner just said, what we need is we need to make better conditions for these workers. We need them. We need to make better conditions. So they invested in a $30,000 modern concrete barracks out toward where Central is. Had 416 prisoners and guards in it, and it was the best facility in the state of Texas at that point. As you might expect, Eldridge manipulated the convict lease system a little bit. He got them to change the conditions of the contract so that they only were shipping their cane, on the Sugar Land Railroad, which he happened to own. But at that time, they were also using the refinery almost exclusively. When the state abolished convict lease in 1912, Eldridge sued. Well, that didn't work very well. So then he came up with a really good idea that the central prison of all of Texas should be right here in Sugar Land, and that he should be paid a $50,000 a year salary. Remember, he was getting 5. Okay. Well, that didn't work, and he managed to get at such odds with the state that the Imperial Refinery, the state refused to use them. They refused to use the refinery at all. Luther Brock. The prisoners picked cotton during the big storm in 1915. The prisons didn't buy Imperial sugar, though. Gus Ulrich was an Austrian immigrant from Schulenburg. He was 26 when Eldridge hired him to manage the convicts at the Imperial Farm in 1906. 1908, he moved over to the refinery. He became assistant manager over all of the holdings, and he was answerable only to Eldridge and Kempner. To build the homes and the other buildings, Ulrich brought in craftsmen, primarily from the Schulenburg area, people he knew. They brought in other people. He shared all of his personal knowledge with Eldridge. Robert Armstrong. Gus Ulrich was Eldridge's right-hand man, his first hire. Ulrich brought in builders of the plant, town to run the store. Louisiana sugar people came for the mill so the refinery could run 12 months. There were half French names and half Czech names. We called them Teutonic Cajuns. Robert Schumann's dad came to Sugar Land in 1915 from Schulenburg. He worked in the grocery department of the company store. He followed my uncle. My uncle Paul was the first, and like many people who worked for the industries, they were from Schulenburg, Hallettsville, Weimar. Some of those fellows would come in and were so good, hardworking, desirable people, Imperial said, "Don't you have someone else over there?" They just came in, and they came in, and they came in. But the sugar company had them from Louisiana. So that's what made up the hub of Sugar Land. Buddy Blair. My grandparents lived in this house, but they originally came to Sugar Land at the dam. Used to be on Blair Road. I don't know if they called the dam after the Blairs or after the dam Blairs. It was the Blair Dam. My grandfather ran the lumber yard for the Sugar Land Industries. My father was a carpenter for Sugar Land Industries, and he built a number of these houses through here. Yes, and my aunt and uncle. B.W. Hughes was a timekeeper for the company. He died when I was 10 or 11. Nola, his wife, lived next door, in the house next door. And then I had another uncle, and he was a sugar boiler, Emmy McBride. They lived down on Brook Street. Robert Armstrong. Gus Ulrich brought most of the employees here. If an employee was no good, he wasn't here. So everybody was a damn good worker by Gus's standards, which were high. He knew everything about the townspeople. He had a nest of spies. He was a nice guy, but if it was a choice between compassion or good business sense would win every time. As the town began to form, workers moved into the Imperial Inn. T.C. Roselle. Now, the Imperial Inn came off the Thatcher plantation. That was the Thatcher home, which sat down there at the bottom of what was called the Grand Central area. It's now the Highlands area. It's now in First Colony. Now, I got this information from Willie Reese, who was born and raised here. He was born in 1890. Willie knew the Thatcher home. He was raised out there. And he told me this. By 1914, the town began building homes for workers. Exterior elevations and floor plans in Sugar Land varied, which was very unusual in a company town. There were a couple waves of construction over 2 decades. Construction began on the hill. The hill was the town's highest elevation, approximately 90 feet above sea level, to the east side of the refinery. The initial dwellings that were built contained a kitchen, living room, a bathroom, and 1 or 2 bedrooms. Sugar Land was a totally segregated company town. The hill, the flats, and Rat Row were whites-only sections of town. The flats sat due south across the rail tracks in an area prone to seasonal flooding. Both the hills and the flats had graveled concrete curb streets with drainage ditches and concrete sidewalks. And eventually the Sugar Land School complex that we're in right now was on the hill. That's where you are right now. The Teacherage and Imperial Inn were in the flats, and that third neighborhood, Rat Row, spread across the front of the refinery. T.C. Roselle. That was the nickname we gave it. That was Imperial Boulevard. There were homes down there. There was a white section. Company homes of the Imperial Sugar Company, rent houses, a nice residential area, called it Rat Row because they had a cotton gin and a feed mill close in that area. You'll find rats in feed mills and cotton gins. The homes on the hill, the flats, and Rat Row had metered water lines, indoor faucets, a bathroom connected to sanitary sewer, electricity, gas and telephone lines. Eldridge had a telephone line put in 1908 between his house and the refinery. So if you paid a little extra rent, you could have a telephone line in your house. I'd like to give you an aside about telephone service, and this is from Buddy Blair, who just happens to be here this evening. Nola Hughes was a telephone operator. Her nephew, Buddy Blair. They used to, people in town would call the operator and say, "I'm going over next door for a few minutes. Can I put the telephone in the bed? And if she cries, call me next door." They babysat a lot of kids that way. T.C. Roselle was born in 1915. His dad worked for the prison system just outside of town. We lived out there until about 1922. Then we moved into town. We got a house, and it had running water, had a bathtub, all sorts of things. Very nice. We didn't have it out there. T.C. Roselle used to ride his bike around town, and I knew who lived in every house. Buddy Blair. It was great growing up in a small town where you knew everybody and everybody knew you. The only bad part about that, if you got into trouble before you got home, your parents already knew before you got there. Robert Armstrong. Housing was standard for the times, not above the working man. It's because of the crew under Otis Enquist. They did repairs and upkeep. T.C. Roselle. All you had to do was call. They had a department at Imperial Sugar, a department. That's what we did. They had carpenters, painters, plumbers, electricians, the whole shebang. They took care of the company houses. If a screen got punched out, call them up. They'd come put a new screen in. A door, a light fixture. One rule for company housing. If you stayed in the same place and you didn't add on, your rent didn't go up. Buddy Blair. When we bought this house rented for $23 a month. 1958, I guess it was. The way they determined the rent was when somebody moved out of it, the company would come in and do some work, and then they'd raise the rent. The rent was never raised unless they came and did work on it. And they just didn't raise it. These houses were here for the employees. Everything so far was whites only. Housing for Black and Hispanic employees was confined to an area called the Quarters. It's now Mayfield Park. Behind the refinery, the horseshoe of Oyster Creek goes around it, and there was a single road in and out at that time that ran along the side of the refinery yard. Those original houses predated the company town. They were not built by Eldridge and Kempner. They ranged from 360 to 552 square feet. This house here, you notice that this house has electricity, indoor and outdoor, or indoor hot and cold water. That's because Kempner, just like with the convicts, started upgrading those houses in the quarters at that time. In 1995, I interviewed two different Black men, Cleophas Jefferson and Woody Robinson. They both used the exact same word to describe the quarters housing when they moved in. They called it luxurious compared to where they lived out in the country. Bertha Pickett Davis. Lived on Avenue B in Ulrich after I married. The house is gone. The large pecan tree inside the imperial fence used to be in our yard. I still go inside the fence and pick pecans if I ask. It had water on the front and back porch, electricity and gas, and an outdoor privy. It was a company house, very low rent. Katie Robinson was born in 1908, and she moved to live with her aunt and uncle in 1917. She told me a different story. Katie Robinson. My uncle was named Irwin Hicks. See, he worked for old man Eldridge for years. They had fishing together in Eldridge, Texas. He was with him all that time. Eldridge brought him down here with him. They tended to do the lots where they owned mules and horses and everything. My uncle was the lots man for the farming. He was kind of Mr. Eldridge's right hand. So they had a place over there by the insurance office for him. Katie pointed across Highway 90, not in the quarters. She pointed across Highway 90 out of the area. Katie Robinson. There were 3 lots, one for my uncle, and one for old man Eldridge's maid, and one for his valet. They were his people. They had houses built for them, and they were the first Black people who had running water in the bathroom. We were the first ones to have electricity. Oh yes, we had everything. Woody Robinson carpooled from the Wharton area to work in Sugar Land until he found a place to live here. I lived in the boarding house, and it was $7 a week. I lived there until I got married. Then I got a cook. Besides a few boarding houses, the company allowed unmarried or newly married whites, blacks, and browns to sublet rooms from other workers. Buddy Blair. When my grandmother and grandfather lived here, they rented that side bedroom to several people because they didn't need it. So they rented the room. The rent money went to the individuals. All the houses in Sugar Land were within a half mile of where people worked, of the refinery and places that they worked. So few residents even owned automobiles until the late 40s. Eldridge and Kempner also owned a third level of housing. And you notice how simple this house is. Captain William McCann Brooks became the tenant farm boss after they lost convict labor. He came in 1914. The standards for all races, white, black, brown, of the tenant housing fell below that of the immediate town. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. Tenant houses were small, 4 rooms with a combination living room and kitchen. Some had half porches and some had a fenced yard. They were usually neat, not a lot of junk around, and they were kind of square in shape. Luther Brock grew up in one of those houses. They had no electricity, a water pump, no running water. They had a privy outdoors. They were just typical farmhouses. I want to take a peek at the tenant farms just for a minute because they were considered part of the company town, even though we think of them as a little outside. They're still the same owners. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. Daddy began his day when he strapped on his pearl-handled pistol and placed his shotgun across his saddled horse. He rode a mile south to the huge barns of Grand Central. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. Daddy always carried a pistol and carried a shotgun in his car, but that was just common. He wasn't the only one who was armed. Luther Brock. Captain Brooks was a hard man to get along with. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. Daddy came home one evening and he had birdshot. Somebody shot him in through the back of his car and shot him in the head. It was just a wound. It was just skin. Not deep, just skin. They didn't tell kids anything then that was going on. But there was some trouble with a guy named Glover from Houston. And they all seemed to think it was some of Glover's men or Glover. Something about a tenant farm problem. Luther Brock. Rumor was that Captain Brooks had been ambushed by a guy named Glover and another guy who was wrestling some cattle nearby. In the late 20s, there was another shooting. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. One evening in the fall, the family and maybe a guest were sitting by the fireplace in their bedroom. Daddy was peeling sugar cane for us when somebody shot through the window into Daddy's chair. He leaned forward to hand us some of that sugar cane, and a bullet shattered through the window right where his head had been. The bullet blasted through his military brush in the bottom of a picture frame. It wasn't too long after that we moved into town, and they never did know who did it. The Brooks family moved into the Albritton Hotel. After Mr. Eldridge moved out of the Ellis house, the old Eldridge house became the Albritton Hotel, Marjorie Brooks Ashford. They had rooms upstairs. Mr. Kempner stayed there on visits. He stayed there until our house on Brook Street was ready. It was the second on the right. The teacherage was on Oyster Creek, near our house. After moving into town, Brooks still oversaw the tenant farmers. Luther Brock. The first year my dad farmed, there were 6 or 7 children at home. He rented us 150 acres and we ginned over 200 bales. Father wanted more land, so we got 200 acres. And we ginned 385 bales. The storm kept us from getting more. Captain Brooks said, "We don't want that man here. He makes too damn much money." So we couldn't get more land. They wouldn't rent him any more land. Farmers helped each other. The year of the big cotton harvest, they borrowed wagons from the state prison farm. Farmers lined up waiting for the gym, where Nelco is now. Brock and his siblings finally got jobs in the refinery, and they moved in and got housing in town later on. I want to take a moment to talk about Sugar Land Industries because there's a lot of confusion about it. I'm not going to make your confusion go away. On January 1st, 1919, Eldridge and Kempner chartered a company called Sugar Land Industries. 4 trustees were Isaac Kempner, his brother Daniel, Gus Ulrich, and William Eldridge Jr. The reason that Bill Eldridge was the trustee is probably because his father was going through a very nasty divorce at the time. The property maintained by the Sugarland Industries included all imperial acreage in and around the town. The Kempner brothers, Ulrich and young Bill, voted on all issues as a joint board, but they were all protected by the Kempner Trust, so they did not have any liability from it. Robert Armstrong. The way this thing worked, it was all divided. Sugarland Industries owned all of the stores and all of the houses south of the railroad tracks. Imperial Sugar owned nothing but the Imperial Sugar Company and all the houses north of the tracks. In 1924, Sugarland Industries rechartered, and the Imperial Sugar Company became a subsidiary of it. Robert Schumann shared most of the residents' views. The Sugarland Industries and the Imperial Sugar Company were two different things, but intermingled. Milton R. Wood was a chemist and engineer who worked in Sugarland before the partners got here. He was a chemist and an engineer, but he really had an avocation for architecture and education. He designed the Sugarland School, where we are now, and he served as superintendent over all of the schools. Robert Armstrong. He dressed immaculately in celluloid collars and with a black hat set squarely on his head. Eldridge described Wood as always conservative. Robert Armstrong. Mr. Wood was very, very straight-laced. There was no foolishness in that school at all. If someone stepped out of line, you were sent home, and you didn't come back until your parents came with you. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. I don't remember Mr. Wood ever being anything but superintendent. He lived in that house over in the corner by the school. In 1917, the modern Sugarland School opened. Robert Schumann. The school custodian was named Poller, and he lived upstairs in the auditorium. That was their home. They had two boys, and they were my age, and I knew them well. Sugarland even had movies in that auditorium. They had the projection back in the Pollers' apartment. They had to go up the stairs. They were silent movies, and as you see, the Pollers lived up there, and they had chickens and that kind of stuff up on the roof of the auditorium. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. There were picture shows on Saturday night. Church women sold candy at the movies, and someone played the piano. Just Saturday nights, but also Chautauqua touring plays and troops. Robert Schumann. We went to school in Sugarland. They had individual rooms in a horseshoe fashion. I understand they sent Mr. M.R. Wood to California, and he studied their schools. He had the first grade, the second grade, the third grade, then a library, then the auditorium. Then come your other grades. That's before the high school was built. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. The teachers changed rooms, but the children didn't. The teachers would change classes during the day. Of course, there was no air conditioning. You just had to raise the window. Robert Armstrong. Then in 1930, they built a second semicircle with a gymnasium and a pool at the center. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. But later on, there was another semicircle built with that gymnasium in the center. In the school paper, it was called the semicircle. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. We graduated in 7th grade, and 8th to 11th grade, that was high school. The teachers changed up some, but not a lot. Mother was on the school board. Teachers had a restriction of 2 years' experience plus a degree to teach at Sugarland. I always wondered if all schools were like that. Where did they get that 2 years' experience? Single white female teachers lived at the teacherage in the flats after 1927. Mary Shelton. All the teachers knew Mama, so in 1939, Mama and I moved to the teacherage. Before that, the teachers who lived there were having to go to the Imperial Inn to eat or to the root beer stand. They wanted to know if Mr. Ulrich would let Mama live there and cook for them. And then they ate right there at the teacherage. Before that, they had a house mother and her husband, but when Mama took over, she cooked. As many as 10 women lived and ate at the teacherage during the school year. Mary Shelton. Of course, for 3 months, summer, Mama had it to herself. She could rent out the rooms if somebody wanted one, but otherwise she had all the expenses. During the 9 months, all the bills, the rent, the paper, and the groceries were added together and divided among them. And that's what they paid. Robert Armstrong moved from Oklahoma City when he was a junior in high school. Robert Armstrong moved out here, and right away they took me right in. The high school kids seldom had a new person come in. Gee, they treated me like visiting royalty. Armstrong also got to play sports, which I never could have done in Oklahoma City. I wasn't big enough, so I began to enjoy it from the minute I got here. It was that kind of town. Buddy Blair. I played tennis, football. I played everything. Of course, it was a small school. Everybody had to play. I also played in the band at the same time. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. The football team had boys from all the grades. T.C. Roselle. In those days, the boys played in every sport, didn't have many, football, basketball, track. The school fielded its first football team in 1927. Of course, that is the Sugar Land football team, or high school football team, is what produced Ken Hall in 1953. And I believe he gave a Chautauqua talk a few weeks ago, but he, as of last week, his senior year record of 32.9 points per game is still a national record. T.C. Roselle should have graduated in 1933, but he graduated in 1934. T.C. Roselle. Because we had a coach. He talked another boy and me into dropping a subject, at least one, and come back for another year of athletics. He said, "You boys are too young to go off to school." We had nothing to do, so he talked us into it. Sugar Land School was whites only. Hispanic children were finally admitted in 1947, but there were no black children before the company town ended in the late 50s. Initially, black and Hispanic children went to a small city colored school in the quarters. In 1939, they finally built the M.R. Wood School, and throughout the 1930s, Sugar Land School still had a budget that was 6 times that of all of the minority schools. Katie Robinson on her favorite memory. Going to school, we danced around the maypole and all that kind of thing, and they'd go to school picnics. Most of the time we'd go someplace. They had excursions on the train for free. Katie Robinson on her biggest disappointment. We didn't have the high school. My sister had to go to Houston. The whites had one. We only had 7th and 8th grade. Bertha Pickett Davis is 15 years younger than Katie. This is Bertha in the picture. We had practice teachers from Prairie View College at M.R. Wood School. I encourage young people to get educated so they can get a good job to be qualified. Bertha is standing in front of the photos of most of her relatives that she helped put through school. I never wanted to live anywhere else, but I would have gone to Dallas for college if I'd had the opportunity. I had a job here, and I didn't have a high school education. I couldn't get another job at a decent salary. We could walk to Imperial. All that time, I never did have a car. Most company towns provided a church, and most cynically, they provided a church because churchgoers were moral and better workers. Churches in company towns were almost always Protestant. They were usually Baptist or Methodist. It wasn't that way in Sugar Land. Robert Schumann. My father came to Sugar Land about 1915, but what was unique is that the father of his bride didn't approve of Daddy or the marriage because he didn't have a church here. Daddy was very instrumental in getting the Catholic Church brought to Sugar Land. T.C. Roselle. The Baptists were the first to have their own church building because after the auditorium in school was completed, they bought the old schoolhouse and moved it down onto their site. The Methodists built their church in 1920, the Presbyterians theirs in 1921. The Catholics, they built theirs in 1927, but the Baptists had their own church building first, before the church buildings were built. Robert Schumann. They had Mass in the school auditorium, and the altar was the piano. That was before the church was built. I do barely remember the dedication of the church. They gave me animal crackers to keep me quiet. Isaac Kempner was a leading player in national Jewish issues, but in Sugar Land he deferred to the Christian beliefs of his employees, and after 1925, after they erected the Char House, there was a 9-story cross on the Char House every Christmas. Of course, church membership, like the schools and housing, was segregated. The colored Baptists and Catholics had separate congregations. Mount Pleasant Baptist Church was located in the Porter's Mayfield Park neighborhood. In her 1995 interview, Bertha Davis said, "And what's nice is some white families joined our church recently." Despite segregation, Sugar Land had some amenities for minorities. They never employed a quarters boss, and the Texas KKK leader just raged because there was no KKK at all in Sugar Land. Woody Robinson. We went in the main entrance of any store in town, no back door, no colored entrance. And the company sponsored events that could be attended by all employees. All company events were open. T.C. Roselle. We used to have CERT Day down at the plant in the winter. They'd harvest the cane, December, January, February, and they'd have CERT Day, and the cars would be lined up, many from Houston, with their buckets. You could go down and get a bucket full of CERT. I don't remember how much you pay for it. Bertha Pickett Davis. I really liked the annual Imperial picnics, and I still like them. They used to call them company picnics, but now they call them service awards. We had one every year, and it was a real event. Everyone was invited. I went to almost all since the first one. Katie Robinson. Everybody could attend the annual picnic. Everything was free. Luther Brock recalled only 3 company holidays before the Depression: July 4th, Juneteenth, and Christmas. Katie Robinson. Juneteenth was celebrated for years and years. We had a dance platform. Imperial also sponsored 2 company baseball teams, the Imperials for white players and the Imperial Tigers for colored players. The teams played alternating games on the West End field. Bertha Davis' husband, Ollie Woodfork, played for the Tigers. He played shortstop and sometimes second base. Everybody that wanted to get out went to the baseball games because there weren't too many activities. After you leave church, well, you had a game and you went to the games. They had them on Sundays. And the field was behind what is now Nalco. What was it like to work in Sugar Land? Luther Brock. Worked on a drag line that pulled cane down and fed it into the crusher. 12 hours a day for $1.20. Went to work for Imperial October 20th, 1926. Worked as a roustabout for the first 3 or 4 years. Then I got a job as a welder. One night on a breakdown about 2 o'clock in the morning, we saw Eldridge coming our way. We saw him bend down and pick up something. And he came up there. He was a big fat man, and he says, "Boys, you see these washers? They cost money." That's how tight he was, a tightwad. Brock worked at Imperial for 42 years, and he finally retired in 1969. T.C. Roselle. When I came out of the Navy, they didn't have any jobs in the plant. So I took a job at the Marshall Canning Company. I worked for those people about 3 months, making 25 cents an hour. Started in 1938. In January, they had a death in the timekeeping department, timekeeping and payroll. A man passed away and they had a vacancy. So I went down to talk to them about the job. I had no experience in office work. I went from high school into the Navy. My salary starting in February 1939 was $75 an hour. That was a lot of money to me. Then in December 1955, they called over and said they had a job that they thought I could handle. So they put me in personnel. Anyone who knew TC knows that he retired from personnel and he knew the name and number of every employee who ever worked at the Imperial Sugar Company. Buddy Blair. When I first started working for Imperial Industries, I worked at the service station. I had worked over there about 2.5 years, And Bruce Edwards came by and said, "We've got an opening in the engineering department. Would you like to transfer to the sugar company?" I said, "You better believe I would." I went to work for them August 30th, 1954. Buddy Blair retired 39 years and 10 months later. Imperial claimed a black man named Willie Reese as the company's oldest, longest-term employee. Reese had started working for Cunningham Sugar back in when he was 9 years old. T.C. Roselle. Willie Reese was a reliable fellow, a wonderful gentleman. He was a legend around here, really a legend. He worked so long down at the plant, it ended up he was a fireman in the power plant for many years. Eldridge and Kempner added Reese's years of working to his Imperial employment, so he officially had more years than either of the partners that owned the company town. T.C. also remembered women working in the refinery. In the 1920s for sure, they worked in the packing department. That's the only place for many, many years, the packing department. Of course, after the war, they began to branch out. Bertha Davis. I worked as a domestic. Then about 6 months before I went to Imperial, I worked at a cafeteria called the Red Barn, about 6 months. I worked there as a waitress. Most of the men had gone off to war. When we started to work in 1943, they were combined, shipping and packaging, because we worked upstairs and downstairs. But later on, they separated packaging from shipping, and then I worked in packaging. Black and Hispanic women worked primarily in packaging. Bertha Davis. The white women worked in the bagging for the sugar, bagging up 5-pound bags, 10-pound bags, and 25-pound bags. And then after the men returned from World War II, all but 5 women were laid off. I stayed on as a porter with more cleanup kind of duties. If you needed to relieve someone upstairs, you just did whatever you needed to be done. Bertha retired in 1988 after 45 years of service. Black and Hispanic men also worked in Imperial. In 1917, Earl Campbell began in the packing department, and Frank Williams, Jr. started in the char house. Antonio Chavez and Jose Rodriguez began 30 years employment in 1925. George Morales celebrated 50 years of employment in 1993. And Cleophas Jefferson began as a laborer and sugar dumper in the wash plant in 1952 and retired 39 years later. Buddy Blair. There have always been black and Hispanic people working in the plant, working right alongside everyone else. Race was never anything that Sugarland thought of. Woody and Katie Robinson shared their work history, and it's just really worth listening to. When I interviewed them in 1995, Woody was 95 years old, and that's what he looked like. Woody Robinson was born in 1900, arrived in Sugarland in 1919. Katie Robinson. He came down here because one lady told him that a young boy like him could get a good job, so he came here. Woody continued. She told me to go to the first man you see with a big white hat on. And I met Mr. Buck Flanagan, and he was taking care of some prisoners out there. He had on a big white hat, and he said, "I'll work you if you want." And I said, "No, no." And he laughed, and I was walking away. I didn't want any answers from him. Finally met Jim Geyer. He rode a horse all the time, and he had a peg leg. Mr. Geyer was the overseer of all this here, the labor hands, white and black. He hired the yards. I was a yard man. I worked outside. They had 100-pound bags of sugar, and you had to load them into a boxcar. I worked there for about 2 weeks. I was slowing them down. I only weighed 135 pounds. Katie Robinson. What they'd do is they'd all go over to the office, to Old Man Eldridge's office every morning, the laborers, and he'd send them out on different jobs. After 1929, Woody Robinson worked for Old Man Eldridge. I was his yard man, and I worked in the house till he died. Marshall Cannon came in 1930s. Woody Robinson. I ran the closing machine. I worked there until they closed up. Then I worked in the hospital after I left the canning plant. I took care of them, white and black men. Katie Robinson. I worked for a family for 18 years, the Gunthers, E.O. Gunther. I raised their children. I made $1 a day. Management all had help, all black. Katie Robinson. Katie Robinson kept in touch with the Gunther children after they grew up, and she wrote to them even after she didn't work for them anymore. Katie Robinson. It was 1942 after the war broke out. Then I worked in the canning plant for 2 or 3 years. I left there, and then I worked at the restaurant. The last job I had was for Mr. Rouse. He owned the Sugarland drugstore. I worked there till he moved, then I retired. In 1995, she was in contact with all of her former employers. Katie Robinson. I don't think they fired nobody. Of course, during that time, it was work or walk. Woody Robinson. Jim Geyer said, if you don't want to work, the road goes east and west. Go get on it. The road goes east and west. I think I mentioned that Sugarland flooded, and it flooded badly. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. I remember that the Brazos got out of its bank one time and came up and flooded south of our house. By 1917, the house had, the company town had 465 residents and a population of about 1,200 people. And you've got a lot of money invested here. So the partners went ahead and invested $700,000 in flood control projects. Milton Wood, M.R. Wood, who did the schools, he oversaw the operation. Luther Brock. I watched dredging on my way to work. They dug Cleveland Lake, then they dredged Brooks Lake, crossed the highway, and pumped dirt back onto the road. By 1929, Cleveland, Brooks, and Elkhire Lakes reached depths of 17 feet. They all channeled into Oyster Creek. We had levees around the town that were from 2 to 14 feet high, and they'd leveled all of the swampy areas. So they got it under control. In his lifetime, T.C. Roselle said he never saw any flooding. And speaking of T.C. Roselle, I want to share a water-related recollection. T.C. Roselle. We grew up swimming in Oyster Creek. That was very spacious among the alligators. We didn't think anything about it. Alligators were thick. I mean thick. Alligators and turtles and fish. I thought about that swimming with the alligators for many years, and I shudder to think about it. It's always amazed me my whole grown life how it was that no one was ever gobbled up by an alligator. Of course, the school mascot was the gator. T.C. Roselle about subdivided land after Sugarland was incorporated. I saw the name Elkhire Lake, so I went to the president of Sugarland Industries and I said, where the devil are you getting such a name as Elkhire Lake? That's Alligator Lake. In the middle of all of this, Eldridge was getting a very nasty divorce, and it threatened the town a little bit because the finances that were involved. In July of 1919, he remarried. He remarried a young telephone operator named Laura Steinem, and less than a year later, she died. So in her memory, he set up the Laura Eldridge Hospital. Before the hospital, there were all home births. There were doctors around, but there were home births. And so I wanted to share a couple of those with you. T.C. Roselle. I had 3 sisters, 2 older and 1 younger, and we were all born right here in Sugarland. Well, not right here. We were born at Chautauqua Plantation, what is now New Territory. And there was a little house we were renting, so that's where we were born. Dr. Dethridge delivered us. Robert Schulman. I was born right here in Sugarland in that house on 4th Street on July 29th, 1924, at home. I was delivered by Miss Bockert and Miss Schaumeyer, both ladies from Richmond, from Rosenberg. His 4 brothers were born in the same house. Now, the original hospital that we see here sat right across the street from where we are right now. It was across Lakeview. After the hospital opened, Robert Armstrong. We had a hospital, and most of the time we had 3 doctors. One served the prison system, and he worked part-time for the prison system and part-time here. A town of 1,200 didn't have that. Katie Robinson. The hospital was nice. They had nice doctors, and they treated you nice. Now, I told you that the hospital is named for Eldridge's second wife, There were a lot of rumors that he was a womanizer, and I have one occasion to share that's okay, that I can share with you. Minnie Bell Hinkle taught in Sugar Land, and one day she wanted to catch a train, according to her niece, Marjorie Brooks Ashford. Mr. Eldridge told her he'd have the train stopped if she'd kiss him at the station. He stopped the train and she kissed him. Mr. Eldridge later offered her a gorgeous big ring, and she said she wasn't about to marry him. Mr. Eldridge always squiled the teachers around. In 1922, 60-year-old Eldridge did marry a very young teacher named Abby Masterson. She'd been here for 2 years. Now, we mentioned the train several times, and I want to just mention what some folks said. Luther Brock. To go to Wharton, you took the train, the dinky, came through at 7 in the morning, brought you back at 5. Over across Main Street, there was a tower, and they controlled it. He'd throw the switch, cost 25 cents. He had a few cars. Katie Robinson. My sister lived in Rosenberg, so I'd go and see her once a week. He called it the dinky, and it cost 50 cents round trip. Katie Robinson also remembered that in World War II, a bus ran during World War II that brought workers from Rosenberg. Now, we've mentioned a lot of amenities at the company town, and I have to mention these few. Katie Robinson. You couldn't come in here and sell nothing because Sugar Land had everything they needed. The price was not expensive, no. They had an iceman, they deliver your ice, they deliver your groceries, they deliver everything. T.C. Roselle. Nan Scarborough Miller lived on Rat Row. Her father ran the dairy. Katie Robinson. Yeah, they had a dairy right beside the lake, just as you crossed the railroad tracks. Right over the track was the dairy. When I came in 1917, they had a saloon. Then when Prohibition came in, they had to close it, so they made it into the market. And in back of it, it had an ice house. And they had, behind the ice house, they had their own calaboose behind the bakery. And when something happened at night, the boys or men, they'd have to arrest them. They'd put them in there, and the next morning, they'd let them out and they'd go to work. Luther Brock. The jail was 6 by 8, held 2 or 3 men, only used it one time. A black man stole sugar. He was caught. There's no fence around the plant then. And you know, he was listed as Man of the Month later on. In 1925, the partners erected a new $1 million char house, and it is the most prominent feature still in Sugar Land. Luther Brock. I worked on the char house construction. I painted with the windows. The 9-story brick addition promised to double production and beat out a lot of competitors. There were a lot of competitors coming up. In 1928, the last Texas-grown cane was processed at Sugar Land, and then Imperial's last raw sugar mills were disassembled and sold as scrap. 1928, Eldridge also built a lavish mission-style mansion, which is just down the street from us right here. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. He warned Daddy not to let anyone know how much it cost. It had rugs specially woven in Spain and a whole soda fountain in the kitchen. Mr. Eldridge had workers take chains and beat up the floors to make it look old. In 1928, Kempner's son Herbert began working in Sugar Land. And in 1930, Herbert Kempner moved into a 2-bedroom bungalow across the street from the Eldridge mansion. T.C. Roselle. Herbert moved here in Sugar Land in 1928, fresh from Harvard. He started in the shipping department. That later became the standard operating procedure for management trainees. In 1929, the industries leased 3 campsites to Humble Oil and Refining Company, a pumping station to Humble Pipeline, and a salt dome to the Gulf Production Company for oil. T.C. Roselle. We had a Humble camp right down there in what is now First Colony, down by the levee. That levee that runs right down the middle of First Colony now, that's where the Humble camp was. They had a store out there, of course, a grocery store, didn't have a post office, didn't have a clinic. In 1929, an imperial chemist mixed up some drilling mud and they allowed him to lease some land from them, and he started Visco Products. Visco Products, of course, became Nalco eventually. In 1929, the Sugarland Industries was having some serious financial problems. By 1932, everything about the original partnership began changing. Eldridge's oldest son, Bill, committed suicide. Robert Armstrong. Bill was snake bit from the start because the old man expected more out of him than he was able to give. He never would be able, and he knew it, never would be able to come up to the old man's expectation. Also, in 1932, Eldridge's close friend and tenant farm boss, William Brooks, died, and Eldridge's health was so bad at that point that they didn't even tell him that his friend had died. On August 20th, 1932, Eldridge died in Herman Hospital. T.C. Roselle. Mr. Eldridge was an on-the-spot manager. He lived here, of course. The Kempners did not until later. He died in August of 32, Mr. Eldridge. I remember him well, but he was gone when the Depression hit. It's probably a good thing. 1934, Herbert Kempner became treasurer, purchasing agent, and director for Imperial Sugar, and the Great Depression started really to set in. They allowed independently owned Marshall Canning Company to move into Sugarland, the first non-company business to be in town, and they took over the abandoned Sealy Mattress Texas Fig Company building there. Luther Brock. 2 days I worked in the refinery, and 3 days I cut brush from the Oyster Creek Slough for the government. I don't think they ever laid anyone off. The sugar company took care of them. It was pretty tough. Of course, I was married then, and it got to be so that I couldn't pay house rent. There was my mother and father, my sister, my brother, and me and my wife. We all lived in one house. It was called the Tice House then. It was on 2nd Street, which used to be 1st Street. 1st Street was called Front Street. T.C. Roselle. The company operated some days 2 days a week, some days 3 days a week, but they never ever laid off. They kept the people on the payroll. The company didn't make anything. They lived in company houses, and if they got behind on their rent with utilities and grocery bills and so forth, the company did not push them for it. They just carried them in the books until they could make enough. In 1938, when I came out of the Navy and went to work, things were still slow, but they began to pick up in 1939 when the war in Europe started. That started them, and things got busy all over the country. Katie Robinson. In the Depression days, they always provided. No one ever went hungry. Didn't nobody suffer. They were provided for. If you don't have it, you can owe it. T.C. Roselle. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Jesse Jones headed in Washington, D.C., FDR got him up there. They headed that thing. The company borrowed the money, from the government actually, to keep this place alive. I've heard them talk about it. It must have been something. It was on the edge all the time, almost went under so many times. But the Kempner brothers, the family, they pulled their money, the entire family's fortune. I shudder what would have happened if they hadn't done that. Marjorie Brooks Ashford. The company nearly went broke. Mama lost a whole lot. Daddy liked preferred stock, and they couldn't pay dividends. At the time, she lost about $27,000 in dividends. They just had to erase. Then gradually, they issued common stock. But I know Mama lost a good bit of her assets. She was lucky she didn't lose the whole thing. Okay, by definition, the company town, remember the definition, it fell right below company store and right above the company union. And in 1938, Herbert Kempner heard that people wanted to unionize, and he went ahead and let them use the refinery buildings, and they did organize in 1938 for the United Sugar Workers Local Union number 917. Now, during the life of the company town, they never once called a strike. So it was a compatible thing. Haywood Davis was the first black union president in 1975. His wife, Bertha Davis, remembered Herbert Kempner. You could go to him directly with problems. You could talk to him face to face. He was humble. The country soon entered World War II, and Sugarland men went off to serve. T.C. Roselle. Actually, I had 2 stints in the Navy. One back in the 30s before the war. Then in 1942, I volunteered back into the Navy because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. I felt very strongly about it. I was really upset. I had been to Pearl Harbor several times during my stint in the Navy the first time, as a young guy. I've got to go back in the Navy. I feel so strongly about it. I went to my wife and I said, honey, this has really upset me. It's really made me mad. The fleet had been decimated at Pearl Harbor. I could just picture it. I went back into the Navy and I served 3 years during the war. And then I came home. By the end of 1945, Herbert Kempner was president of Imperial. He continued to modernize and upgrade the town, but on October 20th, 1953, he died of lung cancer. Bertha Davis. To mark Herbert's passing, they had a few minutes shutdown of the plant. It should have been more. The Korean conflict broke out, and local men once again served. Buddy Blair. I was in Japan on R&R, rest and relaxation, they called it, and I decided to call home. I called. I can't remember whether Aunt Nola or Edna Schaefer was on the switchboard that night. Of course, it was a small switchboard, and I'd spent many, many nights down there with Aunt Nola because they had a night operator and they had an alarm on it. Whenever the phone rang at night, it would wake them up and they'd go answer the phone and run the call. It was about 8:30 when I called. I called the number 377J, something like that. The operator said, well, they're not home. They're downstairs at the Lions Club Carnival on Main Street, right in front of the old store. She said, hold on, I'll send someone. So she called the phone down at the grocery store, the payphone. Whoever answered it, she said, run and get the Blairs. There's a call from Japan. They ran and they got them. Herbert Kempner began upgrading the porter's housing before his death. When workers wanted to start buying their own homes in the 50s, the town responded by selling houses for company-held mortgages, even though it was technically still a company town. T.C. Roselle. In 1955, they opened up a subdivision called Mayfield Park, Imperial Sugar Company did, and sold the lots to people who wanted to buy them and arrange financing so they could pay for it. And they built their own houses. Bertha Davis. She purchased a newly built house on Avenue G in 1955. I never wanted to live anywhere else. I interviewed Katie and Woody Robinson at their Geyer Street home and asked, is that when they built their house? Woody started laughing. No, got an automobile in 1952 and bought our first house in Houston. Woody had heard that Old Man Eldridge claimed no black would ever own a house in Sugarland. I heard it so often that even 20 years after Eldridge's death, he still believed him. In 1958, Buddy Blair purchased the home his grandparents had lived in on the hill. We paid $5,800 for the house and almost a third of an acre. The Blair and Robinson houses sit almost across each other on Oyster Creek. In the late 1950s, Sugarland was in the extraterritorial jurisdiction for Houston. The only way to protect the autonomy of the town was for Imperial and Sugarland Industries to turn the control over to their residents. The company town died quietly after incorporation. T.C. Roselle and other residents helped gather signatures for Sugarland to incorporate. T.C. Roselle. Talk about changes. For a company town to an incorporated city, those of us who were born and raised in a company town, and many of them were, we had lived here all these years and had everything done for us. Never had to pay any taxes, no insurance. In the old days before incorporation, Imperial Sugar Company furnished a garbage pickup 6 days a week. They picked your garbage up every day, Monday through Saturday. Sunday was the only day we didn't get garbage put out. So Incorporated, we get this notice that there'll be garbage pickup on the curb. That you've got to put it on the curb in only 2 days a week. I said, and everyone else said, my gosh, they'll have this town stinking. Just 2 days a week? That's unheard of. Robert Armstrong returned to Sugar Land after college and raised his own children here. This was just a darn good place to live. There was security here, and you knew all the people. You confidently expected you'd marry the local high school girl and get a job at the sugar company, just like your daddy did. Good jobs, well taken care of. I asked why anyone returned to Sugar Land after seeing the big wide world in military service. T.C. Roselle, because this place, it was home. It never crossed our mind to move. Buddy Blair. Somebody would say, you ought to move. No way. The only way I'm moving is when they carry me out. The company town didn't own your soul. You carried it in your heart. T.C. Roselle had a great quote, and this is what I'll end with tonight. I'm Sugar Land born and I'm Sugar Land bred, and when I die, I'll be Sugar Land dead. Thank you.